Before this World Championship, I was really high on Flash Wolves. And you could probably go through my content or other videos and say that that's almost true of every time Flash Wolves come to the World Championship. I always think that they're going to do better than they look like they will. I always think that they're going to get out of group stage. I'm pretty down to earth about their chances in best of five situations and things of that nature, but generally around group stage, I think Flash Wolves are really awesome. So, of course, I was convinced, just as many people were, that this was going to be Flash Wolves' year. They scrim consistently against Royal Never Give Up. They started to change the way that they're approaching the mid to late game. This was probably their most exciting season ever. But then the same result happened. They almost made it, but didn't. Why might that be the case? Well, Flash Wolves always sort of trip over the finish line, and it's always kind of written off as they have really good approach to the early game, but their mid game is a disaster. Their late game is a disaster. I don't think that that's the case this time, and even when it is, it's not something that can be overgeneralized. It's generally a specific thing that they're missing. 2017, last year's Worlds, was probably the only Worlds where I wasn't really high on Flash Wolves. You had Maple performing worse than his normal state. I would say that was probably his worst split of his career domestically, and you had a switch to the Ardent Sensor meta, and you obviously, Sword Art is not necessarily the best when he's put on mage supports. Sometimes he can play well on mage supports, but his team really relies on the game impact that he can have in those scenarios. Also, I felt like a lot of Flash Wolves' approach to setting resets and having good tempo was kind of figured out. Like, the advantage that they had at the start of the year over some teams was sort of figured out by IEM internationally, and G2, for example, have said that they've learned a lot from them, particularly perks. 2016, though, I did have pretty high hopes for them, but the big problem was the move away from the lane swap. I felt like Flash Wolves were a bit reliant on the lane swap, especially with at the time they had their AD carry NL. And going way back into 2015 when we had perhaps Flash Wolves' most successful year on the international stage, Flash Wolves often would do really interesting lane swaps where they would even opt into trading all the way to inhibitors so that they could have kind of NL farm and get to the point where he has so much gold that he's either the bait or that he's just effective even when he has poor positioning. Obviously, they weren't relying on that particular strategy, but still, they always had very creative lane swaps, and I felt like going to the lane swap meta and lane swaps dying at that World Championship really kind of hurt their ability to adapt and their ability to change. 2015, obviously, Flash would have a very good year, but even then, in the quarterfinal stage, Origin were sort of able to target the AD carry picks that Flash Wolves wanted to rely on, and they were able to stall out the kind of snowball mid strategy with picks like Anivia. So my takeaway with Flash Wolves isn't that they always are super good early and suck in the mid to late game. That was never really Flash Wolves' problem. Flash Wolves always had the same problem, but it took different forms. They came to the group stage with one thing. And then, if that one thing got figured out, they just, they couldn't adapt. And the same thing happened this year. So what exactly is Flash Wolves' thing? If you paid attention to Reddit or Narrative Wake or anything else, you probably heard that Flash Wolves and RNG are dedicated scrim partners. They both came to the World Championship with a really kind of similar take on the meta, if you will. Flash Wolves and RNG both came in with dedicated bruisers in their mid and top lane as an option, and a really aggressive, fast, clear jungle, as well as a scaling bottom lane. The philosophy was clear mid, clear top, go bottom, make sure that you are taking over the game with your hyper carry. Of course, there are very obvious problems with this approach that have been obvious problems from the approach since people started playing this approach. Of course, the biggest one, probably, is the nameplate under Flash Wolves' third person, which is Betty, not UZI. That's going to make that really difficult to do in general if you're Flash Wolves, just because you have Betty instead of UZI. Obviously, a lot of LMS analysts are very, very high on the bottom lane combo of Betty and Sword Art, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're the best in lane, and I'm not going off of the broadcast stats, because the broadcast stats very obviously do not care about specific performances or champion picks or anything like this, because here we have Varus Tahm Kench versus Kaisa Alistar. Of course, he should be down CS in that lane. I'm not talking about stats. I'm talking about just in general how the players position in team fights, what they get out of their champions, etc., etc. So not to be down on Betty, he's definitely an upgrade over an L, and I approve of the organization sort of making that trade over time. I think it's given them way more dimension than they previously had before, and on the whole, I think Betty was underrated before this year. This year, I thought he got a bit overhyped. But overall, the TLDR of this is that's going to be one problem. The rest is just going to be a lack of other damage threats. Generally, you want something else coming out of top lane or mid lane or jungle. Here, you have Aatrox and Talia, so that's not bad, but it's definitely difficult to secure those types of picks going forward or ensure that you will, and Flash Wolves continue to sort of go for lower damage compositions. Anyway, in this game, let's just talk about some of the cool things that they were doing on the first day. And yes, it is the Fungu Buffalo, but it's still really cool, and I'm still happy that this went over. You see the complete and utter control of vision that they have in this particular setup. You have the pinks here, so you're instantly alerted if Tahm Kench goes through to get vision. With that last pink that was placed, you have a pink setup here around. They'll show it again if I remove this. Thank you, League of Legends, for this, having this on the VOD. So yeah, you have your pink around the dragon right there. You have the pink near mid lane, so there's almost no way for anyone to kind of be aware of Maple's movements in this regard unless you see other players moving through, setting up vision. That's all cool. It makes it really nice for Flash Wolves to get this pick, and I've always really admired their early game vision setups, but it's definitely what they need to happen. They need to be able to collapse on the bottom lane that is going to be aggressive into the Kai'Sa, Alistar, and overextend. They want to rely on picks like Talia and Sion that can have a lot of mobility, but also sort of buddy dive, buddy gank, buddy have pressure, destroy things, etc., etc. So I think that in general, not a terrible approach and not a terrible first composition for them to draft. But if you paid attention to the rest of this group, you know that you're immediately going to come into some kind of conflict.
Hanabi on the front line. Betty and the rest of the Flash Wolves taking the Baron down now to about 1/3 HP. Hanabi still trying to run interference. Jankos wants to go in. If he steals this away, it's going to be massive. Red team has slain Baron Nashor, secured by the Flash Wolves, but at what cost? Wonder's taking down the base. He's on to Nexus turret number 2. He's got the cannon minions. G2 just needs to stop the backs. Hanabi's made it back into the base, but Wonder flashes to the side. He'll be controlled, but never killed. And G2 find their win.
As in Group B, you had the Western teams, in this case G2, coming in to change the meta. And as Jensen, the coach for EVOS, said, Flash Wolves are meta setters, not meta solvers, whereas the rest of the group, I felt, fell more squarely into the meta solver category. But where I'll disagree with Jensen is that G2's strategy didn't just rely on Camille, it relied on having a very good top lane counterpick. Let's kind of refresh our memory as to what group Flash Wolves are in. Right, the one with Afrika, G2, and Fungu Buffalo, also known as the group with the good top lane carries that like to get counterpick and like to play 1-4 or 1-3-1 compositions, and Flash Wolves is just playing a bunch of tanks and trying to group mid and not necessarily always drafting good tools to do that. Yeah, this is gonna be rough. When I saw what happened to RNG in the first day of group stage, and they kept doing the double tank hyper carry sort of drafting in their first couple of games, I had a pretty good idea that this would be rough for Flash Wolves based on the information that they scrim a lot. So I thought that Flash Wolves very likely would have the same kind of bad take, and whereas RNG adapted, they also had an extra game to kind of get away with not knowing what to do, and Flash Wolves historically have been a bad team at just sort of adapting or adjusting and fixing to the meta. And on top of that, their general approach and their general idea of what makes a good team or what makes a good composition features their top laner on a tank, and they don't always have a good answer to what a side laner can do. Domestically, if a team in the LMS had a side lane carry, which was somewhat rare, you had Maple trying to match, but you couldn't always get to a situation where you could match two dedicated side laners, which 1-3-1 ended up being kind of more of the story, with a lot of approach to things like Aurelia plus Akali Aurelia, plus Aatrox Aurelia, plus X. And you couldn't necessarily always ban those out if you wanted to take a good approach to teams like G2, have bot lane picks that you want to negate or nullify. If you have really safe picks like Tahm Kench and Heimerdinger, that just enables Perks and Wonder, no matter what they're playing, to take over the game, and we've done a separate video on that as well. So let's see a bit of a difference between a winning Flash Wolves draft versus a losing Flash Wolves draft. In a winning Flash Wolves draft, you have typical counters to Urgot banned out, typical counters to Urgot lost, things like Aurelia that have been very effective, things like Rise that could potentially get really significant side lane pressure banned out, and then you have a Freak of Freaks going with Vel'Koz, which is usually a good answer to double tank. You have percentage health true damage and good consistent wave clear, but then they ran out the draft with the Akali, which really in this situation, what else are you gonna do? Aatrox is gone as well. But then you have the losing Flash Wolves draft from the second half of the group stage against a Freak of Freaks, where they're able to get Nocturne, which is something that counters any type of side lane push. So Nocturne almost ensures that you'll have a winning 1-4 or 1-3-1 composition. So if you're looking to do that, it's good to pick up or ban Nocturne so that the enemy team can also have an answer to your side lane split pusher and then also have a Nocturne, something that we saw with Cloud9 as well. But they pick that up. Flash Wolves still go with double damage. They think that, you can't necessarily burst a Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath can, if he gets into a fight, burst someone down in exchange, but also can have pretty good lane pressure. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily liking this. You're not going to get to a point where you can counter the hard pressure from Akali or deal with the fact that you have multiple globals from a Freak of Freaks that can always sort of collapse on your side lane. So even if you have a burly Cho'Gath, it's not necessarily something that you want to keep or push past river. Lissandra, you don't really want to push past river. You just don't have a lot of damage outside of your Kai'Sa either. So you're basically stuck at a 3-item win condition at a point. This sort of leads me to the game that Flash Wolves won today. Because what I think they did here that was really key was they answered the AP bottom and the AP in the mid lane with Sion, which made their rotation around the map very flexible. They always had kind of the option of either putting Sion in a side lane, or as you'll see around here, you have both of your carries. You have your Maple Akali and your Betty Sword Art lane in the bot lane. So you can set up kind of a 1-1-3 or a 3-1-1 or anything of that nature depending on when Baron is in a play, because obviously when Baron is in play, you're going to want to have your dual lane on the top side of the map. You want to have your dual lane on the top side of the map. You want to have Muujin on Talia able to collapse alongside Sion on either side lane. So Muujin and Sion are kind of going to be in the mid lane, but you have your 2 matching whatever side laner that G2 have, and then you have your Sion standing in the middle matching the AP duo in the center. So that's sort of your setup there, and you're in a position where you want to have Betty and Sword Art able to rotate quickly to Baron from the top side of the map, but also make it so that any particular split pusher, in this case most likely the Lissandra, or most likely the Lissandra, can't really do much. Meanwhile, in the bottom lane you have Akali versus Aurelia, which obviously this is made possible by the fact that Brand exists and it doesn't have lane entries. So Sion can literally just sit there, take whatever abuse that you have from him when he gets a certain amount of MR, like love taps, and you're a bit useless. Meanwhile, your Sivir is scaling and you can have the 500 CS Sivir win condition and win the game off of that. It also allowed Flash Wolves to make some really creative and interesting plays. For example, you have Flash Wolves, Betty, and Sword Art coming down. There isn't necessarily vision of this. They see Wonder in the bot side of the map. You had Akali resetting from top lane, so already moving for this. You can teleport in from G2, but you already got the heads up on them. You have a Navi able to rotate very quickly from the mid lane, and just this isn't really a good fight for G2. And it's almost never going to be a good fight for G2 because you always have your front line able to stand in the middle and absorb as much pressure as possible. This wasn't really something that was super replicable in the tiebreaker because Flash Wolves didn't necessarily want to invest the same bot lane bans in order to get a brand, especially when they felt like other champions were giving them way more havoc, and they theoretically had an answer to Heimerdinger. They had left it open earlier in first fades, and now they had one here. In theory, Mordekaiser Tahm Kench, not the worst answer to Heimerdinger you can ever possibly have. Heimerdinger has the annoying ability to put turrets up, and they do damage over time to anyone who approaches. Tahm Kench can eat the turret, also has the ability to pop gray health, so that any sort of poke effects are less impactful. You also have Heimerdinger's insane push potential with his W, doing damage over time to anyone who comes in contact. Usually then it's useful to have a support that's accompanied with him that closes the gap, but obviously once you get level 6, Tahm Kench is pretty good at doing that. Tahm Kench is also pretty good at having good sticking potential, slowing the enemies. It's not as strong as something like an Alistar. Also, Tahm Kench and Mordekaiser have reasonable synergy in the fact that Mordekaiser's W and AoE over time stays active, and when they're touching, they get kind of the bonus damage dealing with the enemy units. So theoretically, you should be able to get a great deal of pressure in the bottom lane. The downside to the Mordekaiser, as an answer to the Heimerdinger, is that if you get out of laning phase and you haven't taken a bunch of turrets, you haven't taken a bunch of dragons and used the dragons as siege tools on enemy turrets, then Mordekaiser scales like crap. He's going to be effectively useless, whereas Heimerdinger actually has insane scaling ratios in almost all of his abilities, has a lot of AoE damage, so it's a bit of a misnomer that Heimerdinger isn't useful in teamfight scenarios, doesn't have good and superior wave clear. At a certain point in the game, Mordekaiser just becomes a useless, worthless champion. And this is where we get to the problem. As you've already seen show up on the game clips that I've shown so far, there's a ridiculous amount of pressure coming out of G2's mid lane and top lane duo. They have a really, really hard winning solo, so even though you have this theoretical idea and notion that Flash Wolves should have so much pressure on the bottom lane, their mid lane, it should almost always be pinned under turret. That setup really restricts Flash Wolves to get the dragons they need and the snowball they need out of the Mordekaiser lane, because obviously you're going to have TP priority if both top laners have TP. You're going to have roam priority if mid laner has roam. A lot of people might say that the matchup between Aatrox and Urgot is a little bit debatable, but in the cases where both players are good, generally you see Aatrox get lane priority just through his persistent Qs. Also, you never really want to lane in the early game as Ryze against Aurelia, and Relic is also a pretty good answer to Urgot, so it's not even a situation where you have an option for Flash Wolves to swap their solo lanes, kind of like Afrika did in the earlier match. In general, because of the amazing amount of pressure that the solo lanes were able to exert, you couldn't get a lot to deal with the bottom lane. And I think Flash Wolves spent a little bit too much time being preoccupied with G2's bottom lane picks, rather than having an answer to them and caring more about the side lanes, because I just think the safety and the general comfort of Hjarnan and Wadid doesn't necessarily win games, but it allows for the other lanes to carry. And there are a select number of picks, so I think just keeping their draft approach, leaving a Akali open, leaving things how they may, was probably the better idea that Flash Wolves could have had, but they didn't do that. They just didn't adapt, and it was a difficult win for them. It was a difficult game for them, and any type of situation where you're not able to really answer a sideline splish pusher, you want to keep your top laner on a dedicated tank or bruiser, you don't have some of his best comforts like Aatrox open, it becomes really difficult, I think, to adapt, to just kind of feel the flow of the game, and to really get out of the group that they were cast into. So people looked at this and said, maybe Flash Wolves have an advantage. Maybe they have a situation where the fact that they play differently will get them out of group. In the end, I think it hurt them, and they weren't really able to adapt to the meta set by the rest of the teams. Real quick before I go, someone asked me in the comment section of my last video whether I felt that the Evolving Group B or the Evolving Group A meta was going to be superior. So theoretically, if you had a Group A type team, meet a Group B type team in the bracket stage, and more specifically, I would say probably they were asking about a C9 type disengage, counter-engage team, and a G2 or Afrika type side lane, split pushing, safe mid lane, potentially 1-3-1 composition. So obviously Afrika and Cloud9 can meet each other. So what would happen in a scenario where they encountered each other? I think both of them are aware of the Nocturne kind of condition, where champions like Nocturne can collapse really hard on side lane split pushers and make it very easy to win in a 1v1 scenario in a matchup that maybe you wouldn't normally win. So I fully expect that Nocturne would be off the table. You might leave some other options open like the Galio or Tom Kench that can lean really hard, and you can have one team pick one and the other team pick the other, but I feel like Nocturne is kind of the absolute must ban, or the absolute must be off the table. In the condition where that doesn't happen, then I think actually probably the Afrika type team would have a better condition, because you're never sort of engaging super hard on the Zillion. You don't have to panic that they're scaling too much because your side lane pusher is scaling really well, and maybe Zillion gets good priority in the mid lane for the other team, but they potentially don't have as much of a good answer to the side lane. Obviously, I think C9 is adaptable. It can kind of play both. You saw Licorice and Jensen both playing split pushers in the Hecarim and the LeBlanc. I thought their 1-3-1 was really well done overall, not just with the caveat of 4 and an A team, just well. So I think that you're in a scenario where you end up where C9 and Afrika kind of actually end up playing the both thing, and you don't really see the C9 engage, counter engage composition rise. Teams like G2 and Flash Wolves, I feel like the engage, counter engage type composition would have been good, because throughout that game we saw a lot of stuff where people were too much overextending in the play, and G2 was a little bit more off of that than Flash Wolves. They had a little bit more overextensions. When they got good objectives, they would just keep going rather than pushing the wave backing, those types of problems. So I think that then, the C9 composition might actually be pretty good against that type of problem. Overall, I would expect to see, if C9 and Afrika played against each other, they would kind of play the Group A meta as opposed to the Group B meta. So hopefully that's an answer.